The age you were born into is not a random event, nor is it the result of human actions alone. It is a consequence of a vast cosmic cycle, a cycle that unfolds over thousands of years and shapes the very fabric of time and consciousness. In the Vedic tradition, this cycle is known as the yugas, 4 great ages that represent different phases of spiritual development for humanity. Each yuga has its own characteristics, its own challenges, and its own lessons, and each one builds upon the last. But the age you were born into is Kali Yuga, the last and most challenging of the 4 yugas. Kali Yuga is often described as the age of darkness, an age where the divine presence in the world is almost entirely withdrawn. It is the time when humanity, having lost its connection to the sacred, finds itself adrift in a sea of confusion, materialism, and spiritual amnesia. The ancient sages foresaw this age long before it arrived. They understood that humanity would pass through a series of spiritual stages, each one marking a step away from the original, pure connection with the divine. In the earliest yuga, known as Satya Yuga, the world was filled with light and truth. The gods walked among us, and the connection between humanity and the divine was as natural as breathing. There was no need for rituals, no need for religion, because the divine was present in everything. Human beings lived in harmony with the gods, and the world was a place of peace and spiritual fulfillment. But as time passed, the world began to change. The gods began to withdraw, step by step, and with their withdrawal came a gradual loss of spiritual knowledge. In the second yuga, Treta Yuga, rituals and practices were introduced to help humanity reconnect with the divine. The gods were still present, but their influence was no longer as direct or as immediate. Humanity had to make an effort to reach the divine through prayer, ritual, and discipline. In the third yuga, Dvapara Yuga, the distance between humanity and the divine grew even wider. The gods appeared only to the most devoted and disciplined of individuals. Most people could no longer sense the presence of the divine in their daily lives. Spiritual practices became more elaborate, and the rituals became increasingly complex. But still, the connection to the divine was fading, and humanity struggled to remember its true nature. And then came Kali Yuga, the age we are in now. Kali Yuga is the final stage of the cosmic cycle, the darkest phase of humanity's spiritual journey. In this age, the divine is not just distant, it is nearly forgotten. The gods have retreated so far from the world that most people no longer believe in their presence. Humanity, in its quest for material gain and worldly success, has become blind to the spiritual truths that once guided its path. The divine is no longer seen in the natural world, in the rituals, or in the hearts of the people. It has been lost, buried beneath layers of ignorance, distraction, and falsehood. What's worse, this loss of the divine is not an external event. It is not something that can be blamed on a particular group of people or a specific time period. The sages of India understood that Kali Yuga was not merely a time of external destruction. It was a time of internal forgetting. The gods didn't just leave the world. They retreated into the depths of human consciousness. The ability to perceive the divine, to feel its presence in the world, was lost. The very organs of perception that allow us to experience the sacred began to atrophy. People were born into a world where the divine was no longer visible, and they grew up without even knowing that it had ever been present. It is this forgetting, this loss of the sacred, that defines Kali Yuga. The external world continues to function. Cities are built, Empires rise and fall, and human beings go about their daily lives. But beneath the surface, something is missing. The connection to the divine, to the higher truths of existence, has been severed. And this disconnection has profound consequences for the human soul. In Kali Yuga, wisdom is replaced by ignorance, and knowledge becomes a commodity. People seek power, wealth, and status, but they no longer seek the truth. They no longer search for meaning beyond the material world. Spirituality becomes a performance, something to be done for show rather than for genuine connection. And the teachings of the past are distorted, repackaged, and sold as mere entertainment. But there's something even more unsettling. As humanity loses its connection to the divine, it begins to lose its sense of purpose. People wander through their lives, pursuing goals that seem important but are ultimately empty. They accumulate wealth, fame, and success, but they are hollow inside. They are searching for something they can't name, something they've forgotten. And because they don't know what they're searching for, they fill the void with distractions. Television, social media, consumer goods, and fleeting pleasures. But none of these things ever satisfy the deep hunger in their souls. And yet, despite the darkness of Kali Yuga, despite the sense of loss and disconnection, there is hope. For the sages of India didn't just describe Kali Yuga as an age of spiritual death. They also spoke of its eventual end. The darkness, they said, would not last forever. The gods would not remain absent for all eternity. But before we get to that, we must first understand the brokenness of this age, because it is only by understanding how far we've fallen that we can begin to imagine the possibility of spiritual restoration. The brokenness is not just a matter of external circumstances. It is a deep, internal disconnection from the divine. We live in a world where the sacred is no longer visible, and many people have forgotten that it was ever here. This is why we feel lost, why we feel that something is missing. It is the cosmic cycle of the yugas that explains why things are the way they are. The divine, in its infinite wisdom, has allowed humanity to pass through this phase of darkness, of disconnection, in order for us to learn certain lessons. The sages understood that this was not a punishment, but a necessary part of the spiritual journey. Just as night must fall before the dawn, just as winter must come before the spring, so too must Kali Yuga be lived through before the divine can return. And so, here we are, living in the darkness of Kali Yuga, surrounded by the noise and distractions of the modern world. We are born into this broken age, and we are left to navigate it the best we can. But what if the very feeling of something missing, that deep sense of loss and disconnection, is actually a sign that we are ready for the next step in the journey? The sense that something is missing is not a random feeling. It is not a product of modernity or consumer culture. It is a spiritual truth, one that the ancient sages foresaw. We are living in an age of forgetting, and it is this forgetting that makes the return of the divine possible. The ancient texts speak of a time when the divine will re-emerge, when the gods will once again walk among us. But that moment is not an event in the future. It is something that will happen within the human heart. The divine does not return in a dramatic, apocalyptic moment. It returns when enough individuals awaken to the truth within themselves, when they remember the sacred that has always been there, just beneath the surface of their awareness. We may not be able to see it now, but the seeds of that awakening are already planted. The divine is already returning, quietly, in the hearts of those who are ready to listen. And it is this awakening that will eventually bring about the end of Kali Yuga, not through destruction, but through the restoration of the connection between humanity and the divine. But before that can happen, we must first remember. We must first acknowledge the brokenness, the disconnection, and the lostness that define Kali Yuga. Only then can we begin to imagine what it would be like to return to the truth, to the light, to the divine presence that once filled the world. This is the age you were born into, the age of forgetting. But it is also the age in which the divine can return, and in that return, all things can be made whole again. Chapter 2. Understanding the Yuga Cycle. The concept of time in the Vedic tradition is fundamentally different from the way we understand it today. For us, time is linear, a straight line from the past to the future, a series of events that follow one after the other. We measure time in seconds, minutes, hours, and years. We divide it into days, months, and centuries. But in the ancient Indian view, time is cyclical. It's not a straight line, but a wheel, turning endlessly in vast cosmic cycles, each one leading into the next, each one encompassing the rise and fall of worlds, civilizations, and spiritual ages. At the core of this vision of time is the concept of the yugas. The yugas represent 4 great epochs or ages, each with its own distinctive characteristics and spiritual qualities. These ages repeat themselves in an unbroken cycle, spanning immense lengths of time. The yugas form a pattern of creation and destruction, of spiritual ascent and descent, of light and darkness. But they are not just a cosmic blueprint. They are also a map of human evolution, a reflection of our collective journey toward the divine. The yuga cycle is vast, stretching over thousands of years, with each yuga lasting for many ages. The 4 yugas are Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. Each yuga represents a stage in the spiritual development of humanity, and each one brings humanity closer to or further away from the divine. Satya Yuga, the age of truth. The first and most radiant of the yugas is Satya Yuga, often called the age of truth or the golden age. It is the age in which the divine is fully present, where the connection between humanity and the gods is as clear and direct as the relationship between a child and its parents. In Satya Yuga, there is no need for rituals, no need for external forms of religion. The divine presence is felt immediately, and every human being lives in harmony with the sacred, instinctively aware of the divine nature of all things. In Satya Yuga, the world is a place of peace and wisdom. There is no sickness, no suffering, no war, and no strife. All beings are virtuous, and the pursuit of truth is the highest aim. The very air is filled with spiritual energy, and human beings live in complete accordance with the laws of nature. In this age, the gods walk among us, and the connection between the material and spiritual worlds is seamless. The people of Satya Yuga are not bound by the limitations of the mind or the senses. They are not distracted by the material world because they can see beyond it. They understand that everything in the physical world is a manifestation of the divine. There is no separation between the sacred and the mundane, and everything is imbued with divinity. The mind is pure, and the heart is full of love and devotion to the divine. This age, though, is not permanent. The natural course of the cosmic cycle dictates that every yuga, no matter how perfect, will eventually give way to the next. As humanity continues its journey, the connection to the divine begins to loosen, and the purity of Satya Yuga fades. Treta Yuga, the age of ritual. As the divine presence begins to withdraw from the world, humanity enters Treta Yuga, the second age of the Yuga cycle. In this age, the gods are still present, but their influence is no longer as immediate or as direct. The people of Treta Yuga are no longer able to perceive the divine in the same way that the people of Satya Yuga could. Instead, they must now rely on rituals, ceremonies, and disciplined spiritual practices to reconnect with the divine. In Treta Yuga, the relationship between humanity and the divine becomes more formalized. Rituals are established, and the need for sacred texts and spiritual practices grows. The gods, while still present, are not immediately accessible. Humanity must work harder to maintain its connection with the divine, but this effort is still effective. There is a deep reverence for the divine, and people engage in their spiritual practices with devotion and sincerity. While Treta Yuga is still an age of righteousness, the purity of Satya Yuga begins to diminish. The virtues of the people begin to erode, and the world becomes more complex. Suffering, though still rare, begins to appear in the world, and the gods, though revered, become more distant. Despite this, the people of Treta Yuga are still capable of achieving great spiritual heights. The divine is still within reach, but it requires more effort to experience it. The gods of Treta Yuga are not as intimately involved with humanity as they were in Satya Yuga. They remain in the heavens, and while they occasionally intervene in the world, their actions are no longer as direct. The people of Treta Yuga must make offerings and perform sacrifices to invoke the divine. They must observe the rules of Dharma, cosmic law, and engage in rituals to maintain their connection to the higher realms. The retreat of the divine is evident in this yuga, and the world begins to shift toward a more materialistic view. Human beings are no longer solely concerned with spiritual matters. The focus begins to shift to worldly success, and the search for power and wealth becomes more prominent. Dvapara Yuga, the age of duality. The third yuga, Dvapara Yuga, marks a further descent into spiritual darkness. The divine has retreated even further, and the connection between humanity and the gods has become more tenuous. The people of Dvapara Yuga can no longer easily perceive the divine. They must rely on intellectual knowledge and reasoning to understand the truth. But even this knowledge is clouded by the limitations of the human mind. In Dvapara Yuga, duality begins to take hold. The world is divided into opposites, good and evil, light and dark, pleasure and pain. The purity and unity of Satya Yuga are long gone, and humanity begins to experience the full range of human emotions and conflicts. The world becomes more complex, and the simplicity of earlier ages gives way to confusion and misunderstanding. In this age, the focus shifts more toward intellectual knowledge and scientific exploration. While spirituality is still present, it becomes more philosophical and abstract. The gods, though revered, are no longer present in the world as they once were. Their influence is felt through sacred texts and teachings, but their direct intervention in the affairs of the world becomes rare. People in Dvapara Yuga become more attached to material success and power. There is a growing sense of separation between the spiritual and the material realms. People begin to see the world through a lens of duality, good and bad, right and wrong, self and other. The simplicity and clarity of earlier ages give way to complexity and division. The gods, in their retreat, have left humanity to navigate a world of duality. And while the divine is still present, it is not immediately accessible. Humanity must search for the truth through intellectual inquiry and the study of sacred texts. But as the world grows more complicated, the path to the divine becomes obscured. Kali Yuga, the age of darkness. Finally, we arrive at Kali Yuga, the fourth and final age in the Yuga cycle. This is the age we live in now, and it is the darkest of all. In Kali Yuga, the divine presence has withdrawn almost entirely. The gods no longer walk among us, and the connection between humanity and the sacred is nearly severed. The world is filled with confusion, materialism, and spiritual ignorance. In Kali Yuga, the focus is entirely on the material world. People are obsessed with wealth, power, and status, and the pursuit of pleasure becomes the primary goal of life. The pursuit of truth is replaced by the pursuit of self-interest. People no longer seek the divine or understand their true nature. The sacred teachings of the past are distorted, and spiritual practices become empty performances. The gods are no longer directly involved in the world, and their influence is felt only in the form of ancient scriptures and rituals that most people no longer understand. The divine is hidden, obscured by the distractions of the material world. Human beings no longer recognize the sacred in the natural world, and their ability to perceive the divine has atrophied. The gods have retreated into the inner recesses of the human heart, waiting for the moment when they can once again emerge. Kali Yuga is characterized by moral decay, corruption, and the decline of spiritual wisdom. It is an age of confusion, where truth is relative and falsehoods are accepted as reality. The world is filled with chaos and conflict, and people are consumed by their desires. The very essence of Dharma, cosmic law, becomes obscured, and the understanding of the sacred is lost. But even in Kali Yuga, there is hope. The ancient texts tell us that this darkness will not last forever. Just as night gives way to day, Kali Yuga will eventually give way to a new cycle. The divine will return, not as it once was, but transformed. The darkness will eventually lift, and humanity will be given another chance to reconnect with the divine. But for now, we live in Kali Yuga, the age of spiritual amnesia, where the gods have retreated into the depths of human consciousness. Chapter 3. The Prophecy. What the seers predicted. The concept of time, as understood by the ancient seers of India, is cyclical and eternal. The Vedic sages, with their deep wisdom and divine insight, observed the patterns of creation and destruction unfolding over vast cosmic periods. These sages did not merely observe the cycles of nature and time. They were able to perceive the grand design of the universe, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the ebb and flow of spiritual consciousness. With their extraordinary vision, they were able to predict the unfolding of human history and the nature of the cycles that humanity would pass through. In the ancient texts, particularly the Mahabharata, Bhagavat Purana, Vishnu Purana, and Srimad Bhagavatam, the sages provided us with a detailed prophecy about the ages humanity would pass through. This prophecy includes specific predictions about the transition from the golden age of Satya Yuga to the dark age of Kali Yuga. And it's not just a broad, abstract prophecy. It's filled with precise signs, indicators, and descriptions that seem to match the reality we experience today. The most striking aspect of the prophecy is its eerie accuracy. The sages foresaw a time when human beings would lose touch with their spiritual nature, when the divine would retreat, and the world would descend into confusion, materialism, and moral decay. They predicted that in Kali Yuga, the age we are currently living in, humanity would undergo a dramatic shift. This shift would be marked by several signs that we now recognize as being deeply embedded in the fabric of a modern world. The cycle of ages, the context of the prophecy. Before delving into the details of the prophecy, it's important to understand the context in which it was given. The Vedic sages saw time as a vast and cyclical process, with each cycle containing 4 yugas: Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. As discussed in the previous chapter, each yuga represents a distinct stage in the spiritual journey of humanity. These ages are not just historical periods. They are symbolic of humanity's spiritual ascent and descent. The sages of ancient India did not see the yugas merely as random occurrences. They were aware that these ages were a reflection of the spiritual progress or regress of human consciousness. In Satya Yuga, humanity is spiritually pure and directly connected to the divine. In Treta Yuga, rituals and practices are introduced to help humanity maintain that connection. In Dvapara Yuga, the distance between humanity and the divine becomes more pronounced, and the spiritual connection begins to fade. And in Kali Yuga, the divine presence is almost entirely withdrawn, and humanity falls into ignorance, materialism, and confusion. This gradual progression, or rather regression, from light to darkness, from truth to ignorance, is the backdrop of the prophecy. The seers, with their profound understanding of cosmic time, were able to predict not just the arrival of Kali Yuga, but also its precise nature and the signs that would mark its course. The predictive vision of the sages. In the Vedic texts, the sages describe Kali Yuga as an age characterized by moral decay, confusion, and the withdrawal of the divine. They saw that as the age progressed, the spiritual connection between humans and the divine would weaken, and the pursuit of material wealth, power, and pleasure would dominate society. The age would be marked by the rise of falsehoods, the breakdown of dharma, cosmic law, and the loss of genuine spiritual practices. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Vedic prophecy is its description of the moral and spiritual decline of humanity. The seers predicted that in Kali Yuga, human beings would become increasingly self-centered and attached to material desires. They would lose sight of the higher purpose of life, and the divine wisdom that once guided humanity would be forgotten. The focus of life would shift from the pursuit of truth, virtue, and spiritual realization to the pursuit of wealth, status, and fleeting pleasures. The rise of materialism and ignorance. One of the key signs of Kali Yuga, as predicted by the sages, is the rise of materialism. In this age, human beings would become obsessed with the pursuit of wealth, power, and pleasure. The spiritual essence of life would be overshadowed by the desire for worldly success. The sages foresaw a time when material wealth would become the measure of human worth, and people would place more value on external achievements than on inner spiritual development. In Kali Yuga, material desires would become the driving force behind human behavior. People would seek gratification through physical pleasures, social status, and the accumulation of wealth, believing that these things would bring them happiness. This materialistic worldview would lead to the degradation of the human spirit, as people would forget their higher purpose and become consumed by the illusions of the material world. The sages also foresaw the rise of ignorance. As the divine withdrew from the world, humanity would lose its ability to perceive the sacred. The spiritual knowledge that was once passed down through direct experience and divine insight would be reduced to mere intellectual understanding. People would no longer experience the divine through their senses. Instead, they would rely on external teachings and rituals, which would gradually lose their true meaning. In Kali Yuga, knowledge would be misused. and the pursuit of wisdom would be replaced by the pursuit of material success. Intellectualism, rather than leading to spiritual realization, would serve as a tool for self-interest and manipulation. The sages warned that in this age, wisdom would become a commodity, and those who claimed to possess it would often do so for personal gain, rather than for the benefit of humanity. The decline of Dharma and the erosion of virtue. The erosion of Dharma, the cosmic law that governs the universe, was another key prediction made by the sages about Kali Yuga. Dharma, in its highest form, represents the universal principles of truth, righteousness, and justice. In Satya Yuga, humanity lived in accordance with Dharma, and the world was in perfect harmony. In Kali Yuga, however, Dharma would begin to decay. As the spiritual connection between humanity and the divine weakened, people would become increasingly disconnected from the principles of Dharma. The pursuit of personal desires would overshadow the common good, and ethical values such as honesty, compassion, and selflessness would give way to selfishness, greed, and deceit. In Kali Yuga, the very fabric of society would begin to unravel as people turned away from virtue and embraced vice. The sages predicted that in Kali Yuga, the concept of justice would be distorted, and society would become ruled by those who sought power and control rather than by those who upheld righteousness. The corruption of leaders, the breakdown of social structures, and the rise of injustice were all foretold as hallmarks of this age. People would live according to their desires rather than according to the higher principles of Dharma, and this would lead to chaos and suffering. The decline of spiritual practices. In Kali Yuga, the seers foresaw that spiritual practices would become increasingly corrupted. The divine rituals, once powerful tools for connecting with the gods, would be reduced to empty performances. People would still perform the external forms of worship and ritual, but the true essence of these practices would be lost. The sages predicted that spiritual teachings would be distorted, and the path to self-realization would become obscured by superficiality and materialism. In this age, the true teachers of wisdom, the gurus, would become rare. Spiritual knowledge would be increasingly commodified, and people would seek knowledge not for the purpose of spiritual awakening, but for personal gain. The genuine seekers of truth would become few and far between, and the true path to liberation would be hidden beneath layers of false teachings and distractions. The sages warned that, in Kali Yuga, the desire for material wealth and personal success would replace the longing for spiritual growth. The divine teachings that once illuminated the path to liberation would be reduced to mere intellectual pursuits, no longer leading to self-realization, but to self-interest. The age would be marked by a lack of true spiritual guidance, and people would wander through life without understanding the true nature of their existence. The end of Kali Yuga, the dawn of a new cycle. While the prophecy about Kali Yuga is bleak, it is not entirely without hope. The sages foresaw that the darkness of Kali Yuga would not last forever. Just as night gives way to day, Kali Yuga will eventually give way to a new cycle, a new age of spiritual awakening. The end of Kali Yuga will not be marked by destruction, but by a gradual return of the divine. The sages spoke of a time when the spiritual consciousness of humanity would begin to awaken. As the dark clouds of ignorance and materialism lift, people would begin to reconnect with their divine nature. The divine presence, which had retreated into the depths of human consciousness, would gradually re-emerge. The age of Kali Yuga with all its confusion and decay, will eventually give way to a new dawn, a new cycle of creation and spiritual fulfillment. The return of the divine will not come in a dramatic, apocalyptic event. It will be a slow and subtle process, beginning with the awakening of individual consciousness. The sages foretold that a few enlightened beings would begin to realize the truth, and through their example, others would follow. Slowly, over time, the light of spiritual wisdom would begin to spread, and the darkness of Kali Yuga would begin to dissipate. The prophecy, however, did not give a specific time frame for the end of Kali Yuga. What the sages did say was that the shift from darkness to light would occur when enough individuals were ready to reconnect with the divine. The age of Kali Yuga would end not with a cataclysmic event, but with the collective awakening of humanity. And in that awakening, the divine would return, not as it once was, but transformed and refined by the passage through the dark age. Conclusion: living the prophecy. The prophecy of Kali Yuga is not just a description of the world we live in today. It is also a map for our spiritual journey. The seers did not simply predict the decline of humanity. They also showed us the path forward. In the darkness of Kali Yuga, the seeds of spiritual awakening are already present, waiting for us to recognize them. The question now is not whether the divine will return, but how ready we are to recognize it when it does. This is the challenge of Kali Yuga, the challenge of remembering, of reconnecting with the divine that resides within us all. The divine has not left the world, nor has it abandoned us. It is simply waiting for us to awaken, for us to see beyond the distractions of the material world, and for us to realize the truth of our own divine nature. As we move forward through this age of darkness, it is up to us to become the torchbearers of light, to carry the wisdom of the sages in our hearts, and to strive for a deeper connection with the divine. Only then will we fulfill the prophecy and bring about the dawn of a new age. Chapter 4: The God's Departure and the Signs of Our Age. In the previous chapters, we explored the broad concepts of time in the Vedic tradition and the cycle of the yugas. We learned that we are currently living in Kali Yuga, the darkest and most spiritually challenging of the 4 ages. But what does it mean for the gods to have departed from the earth? How do we recognize their absence? And more importantly, how do we navigate a world where the divine seems distant and hidden? The God's departure is not a sudden or dramatic event. It is a gradual process that unfolds over the course of the yugas, with Kali Yuga representing the final stage of this divine retreat. But the absence of the divine is not an absence in the literal sense. The gods have not abandoned humanity. Rather, they have withdrawn their direct influence from the world. They are still present, but they are hidden, waiting, in a sense, for humanity to regain its ability to perceive them. This withdrawal is not punishment, but rather a natural part of the cosmic cycle, a process through which humanity must pass to awaken to its true nature. In this chapter, we will explore the signs that mark the gods' departure from the world, the spiritual decay that accompanies their absence, and the consequences for human consciousness. These signs are not merely abstract concepts. They are observable patterns in the world around us, and they serve as both a warning and a guide for our spiritual awakening. The sages of ancient India saw these signs clearly, and their wisdom offers us a roadmap for navigating the challenges of Kali Yuga and finding our way back to the divine. The God's Departure, a gradual withdrawal. The idea of the gods withdrawing from the world is not something that happens overnight. It is a gradual process, a slow retreat that begins in Treta Yuga and continues through Dvapara Yuga, until it culminates in the almost complete absence of the divine in Kali Yuga. In the earlier yugas, the gods were directly involved in the affairs of humanity, guiding, protecting, and instructing us in the ways of Dharma. But as the ages progress, the divine presence becomes less tangible, more distant, and less accessible. In Satya Yuga, the divine is fully present, and human beings live in perfect harmony with the gods. There is no need for rituals or external practices because the connection to the divine is direct and intuitive. However, as humanity moves through the yugas, the gods begin to withdraw, and the spiritual practices that once came naturally to human beings begin to be seen as external rituals and ceremonies. In Treta Yuga, the divine presence is still felt, but it requires more effort to maintain the connection. Rituals are introduced to help humanity reconnect with the gods, and the first signs of spiritual decline begin to appear. The gods are still present, but they are no longer as intimately involved with humanity as they were in Satya Yuga. As the ages progress, the gap between humanity and the divine grows wider. By the time we reach Dvapara Yuga, the gods have retreated even further. The world is still governed by cosmic principles, but the connection to the divine is no longer as direct. Humanity is left to rely on intellectual understanding and external practices to maintain its spiritual connection. But even this connection begins to fade as the world becomes increasingly focused on material pursuits. The gods remain in the heavens, intervening less frequently in the world below. Finally, in Kali Yuga, the gods have almost completely withdrawn. Their presence is no longer felt directly in the world, and humanity is left to navigate the material world without the spiritual guidance that was once so readily available. The divine now resides hidden within the human heart, waiting to be rediscovered. But most people have forgotten how to listen for the divine presence, and the world is filled with distractions, material desires, and spiritual confusion. The signs of Kali Yuga. The Vedic sages, with their profound vision of the future, foresaw several key signs that would mark the transition into Kali Yuga and the decline of human civilization. These signs are not metaphorical. They are tangible, observable phenomena that can be seen in the world around us. As the divine withdrew from the world, these signs began to manifest, and they have continued to unfold throughout Kali Yuga. The sages did not just describe the physical world, they also spoke of the internal, spiritual decay that would accompany these external signs. Let's explore some of the most significant signs of Kali Yuga, beginning with the moral and spiritual decline of humanity, the rise of materialism. One of the most prominent signs of Kali Yuga, according to the sages, is the rise of materialism. In Kali Yuga, people would become obsessed with the pursuit of wealth, power, and sensory pleasure. The focus of human life would shift away from spiritual fulfillment and the search for truth, and instead, people would become consumed by their desires for material success and comfort. The Vedic sages predicted that the pursuit of wealth would become the primary goal of human life in Kali Yuga. People would become so focused on accumulating material possessions and status that they would lose sight of their higher purpose. The concept of dharma, or cosmic law, would be overshadowed by the pursuit of personal gain. Spiritual wisdom would be relegated to the background, while the accumulation of wealth and the pursuit of pleasure would dominate society. The sages also foresaw that this materialistic worldview would lead to a breakdown in the social fabric. People would become increasingly self-centered, and the bonds of family, community, and society would weaken. The values of compassion, selflessness, and service would be replaced by greed, selfishness, and exploitation. As materialism took hold, the true purpose of life, the pursuit of spiritual wisdom and inner peace, would be forgotten. The decline of virtue and the rise of injustice. Another key sign of Kali Yuga is the decline of virtue and the rise of injustice. In Kali Yuga, the concepts of truth, righteousness, and justice would become distorted. The sages predicted that moral and ethical values would be eroded, and people would no longer follow the path of Dharma. The very fabric of society would begin to unravel as people embraced vice over virtue. In Kali Yuga, the sense of right and wrong would become blurred, and people would justify unethical actions in the name of personal gain. The pursuit of power, wealth, and status would lead to the breakdown of moral principles. Dishonesty, corruption, and deceit would become commonplace, and those who upheld righteousness would be marginalized. The sages also foresaw that the rulers of Kali Yuga would be corrupt and self-serving. Leaders who once upheld the ideals of justice and compassion would be replaced by those who sought power and control for their own benefit. The government and social institutions would be dominated by those who cared only about their own interests, rather than the welfare of the people. This would lead to widespread injustice, inequality, and suffering. The breakdown of spirituality and the corruption of religion. The spiritual decay in Kali Yuga is not just a result of materialism and injustice. It is also linked to the corruption of religious practices. In this age, the sages foresaw that religion would become a performance, a mere outward show without the depth of true spiritual connection. People would engage in religious rituals and practices, but these would no longer serve their original purpose. Instead, they would become empty formalities, performed for social approval or personal gain rather than for spiritual growth. The sages predicted that the true essence of spiritual teachings would be lost, and that religious leaders would become more interested in maintaining their own power and status than in guiding people towards self-realization. The divine wisdom that once flowed freely would become obscured by dogma, ritualism, and material motives. The message of the great spiritual traditions would be twisted and diluted to serve the needs of the powerful, and the genuine path to spiritual awakening would be hidden from the masses. As the world became more materialistic and spiritually impoverished, the divine would be increasingly relegated to the background, and human beings would no longer perceive its presence in the world. The spiritual practices that once led to liberation would become commercialized and distorted, and people would seek quick fixes and superficial solutions rather than genuine spiritual transformation. The internal decay of human consciousness. While the external signs of Kali Yuga are visible in the world around us, materialism, injustice, and religious corruption, the sages also foresaw a deeper, internal decay in human consciousness. As the divine withdrew from the world, humanity's ability to perceive the sacred would diminish. The very organs of perception through which we once connected to the divine, our inner faculties of intuition, insight, and spiritual awareness, would atrophy. In Kali Yuga, human beings would lose touch with their higher nature and become increasingly focused on their ego and material desires. The consciousness of humanity would become clouded by ignorance, and the ability to discern truth from falsehood would be diminished. The sages predicted that people would no longer be able to perceive the subtle, spiritual dimensions of existence and would instead become trapped in the sensory world. This internal decay would manifest as a loss of clarity and purpose. People would become increasingly confused, and the search for meaning would be replaced by a shallow pursuit of pleasure and distraction. The very essence of the human soul, the longing for truth, wisdom, and spiritual fulfillment, would be buried beneath the weight of material concerns. The subtle return of the divine. While Kali Yuga is an age of spiritual darkness, it is not without hope. The sages, in their infinite wisdom, foresaw that the divine would not remain absent forever. Despite the withdrawal of the gods, they predicted that the divine would begin to return, not through a dramatic external event, but through a quiet, subtle process of awakening. The sages described a time when the divine would re-emerge in the hearts of individuals. As the darkness of Kali Yuga reached its peak, the light of the divine would begin to shine again, but in a new, more refined form. This return would not be an external event, but an internal transformation, a shift in human consciousness that would gradually spread across the world. The gods may have withdrawn from the world, but they have not abandoned us. They are waiting for us to remember, to reconnect with our true nature, and to awaken to the divine presence that resides within us. The path to this awakening is not easy, and it requires great effort and discipline. But it is the only way to break free from the illusions of Kali Yuga and rediscover the truth that lies hidden within us. Conclusion: the gods are always present. The gods' departure from the world is not a tragic event. It is a necessary part of the cosmic cycle. The divine does not leave us because it has forsaken us. It withdraws because humanity must learn to find its own way back to the sacred. In Kali Yuga, the gods are hidden, but they are not absent. They are waiting for us to awaken, for us to remember the divine presence that resides within us. The signs of Kali Yuga are not just warnings. They are a call to action. They remind us that the material world is not the ultimate reality, and that the pursuit of wealth, power, and pleasure will never bring lasting fulfillment. The true path to happiness lies in reconnecting with the divine, in awakening to the spiritual dimensions of existence, and in realizing our oneness with the sacred. The divine has not left us. It is waiting for us to find it again. And when we do, the darkness of Kali Yuga will begin to lift, and the light of truth will shine once more. Chapter 5. The Role of Human Consciousness. Human consciousness in the Vedic worldview is not just a passive observer of reality. It is a dynamic force, constantly evolving and shaping the world in which it exists. The sages of ancient India understood the depths of human consciousness and saw it as the key to understanding the rise and fall of civilizations, the cycles of creation and destruction, and the journey of the soul through the ages. In Kali Yuga, we find ourselves in an era where consciousness has descended to its lowest point in the cosmic cycle. But this descent is not a random occurrence. It is part of a larger cosmic plan, a necessary stage in the evolution of the soul. To understand why Kali Yuga is the age it is, we must first explore the role that consciousness plays in the spiritual development of humanity and the cyclical nature of the yugas. The evolution of consciousness. From unity to fragmentation. In the earliest age, Satya Yuga, Human consciousness is in a state of perfect harmony. The mind, body, and soul are united, and there is no separation between the individual and the divine. This unity is the hallmark of Satya Yuga, where human beings experience a direct, unbroken connection with the gods. The purity of consciousness in this age allows for the highest forms of wisdom, love, and spiritual insight to flow freely. There is no need for religious rituals or complex philosophical systems, because the divine is experienced directly and naturally. As we transition into the next yuga, Treta Yuga, human consciousness begins to shift. While the connection to the divine is still strong, it is no longer as direct. Human beings must rely on rituals and practices to access the divine presence. The unity of consciousness begins to break down, and the separation between the individual and the divine becomes more pronounced. However, this shift does not yet represent a significant spiritual decline. Rather, it is a natural part of the cyclical evolution of consciousness. In Treta Yuga, the soul still has access to divine wisdom, but it must work to uncover it through disciplined practices and rituals. In Dvapara Yuga, the fragmentation of consciousness becomes even more pronounced. The mind becomes more active and self-absorbed, and human beings begin to see themselves as separate from the divine. The experience of unity with the cosmos fades, and people begin to rely more on intellectual reasoning and external practices to understand the world. In this age, the divine is still revered, but its presence is felt less directly. Humanity begins to experience the world through duality, good and evil, light and dark, truth and falsehood. By the time we enter Kali Yuga, the fragmentation of consciousness reaches its peak. The divine presence is almost entirely withdrawn from the world, and human beings find themselves trapped in the material world. The mind, once capable of perceiving the sacred, has become obscured by distractions, desires, and the pursuit of pleasure. The very nature of consciousness in Kali Yuga is defined by its separation from the divine. In this age, people experience the world through the lens of ego and attachment, completely disconnected from their higher nature. The role of the mind in Kali Yuga. In Kali Yuga, the mind plays a central role in shaping our experience of the world. The mind, in its most refined state, is a tool that allows us to perceive the divine and understand the deeper truths of existence. However, in Kali Yuga, the mind becomes clouded by desires, doubts, and attachments. Instead of being a vessel for wisdom and clarity, the mind becomes a source of confusion and delusion. The more we identify with the mind, the further we move away from our true nature. One of the key characteristics of Kali Yuga is the dominance of the intellect over the heart. The mind, in its quest for control and understanding, seeks to define reality through logic and reason, but it can only grasp a limited aspect of truth. In Kali Yuga, the mind becomes the primary tool through which people interpret the world, leading to a distortion of spiritual knowledge and a deepening sense of separation from the divine. The sages foresaw this shift, knowing that as humanity moved further away from the direct perception of the divine, the mind would become the primary source of knowledge. In this age, intellectualism, though valuable in its own right, would often become disconnected from the deeper, intuitive wisdom of the heart. Spiritual knowledge, instead of being experienced as a living truth, would become abstract and theoretical. It would be studied from books and taught in universities, but the direct, personal experience of the divine would be lost to the masses. This intellectualization of spirituality is one of the key signs of Kali Yuga. The wisdom of the ancients, passed down through direct experience and inner revelation, would be reduced to mere theories and doctrines. The true essence of the teachings would be obscured, and people would begin to worship the intellectual understanding of the divine rather than the divine itself. The disconnect from the divine, the impact on human consciousness. As consciousness becomes more fragmented and disconnected from the divine, the individual soul experiences a sense of isolation. This sense of separation is the source of much suffering in Kali Yuga. The divine, once a constant presence in the lives of human beings, has become distant, and people begin to feel lost in the material world. The mind becomes consumed by worldly desires, and the ego becomes the central focus of life. The individual, in Kali Yuga, is trapped in a cycle of attachment and aversion. We chase after things that we believe will bring us happiness, only to find that they bring us no lasting satisfaction. The more we identify with the ego and the mind, the more we are bound to the cycle of birth and death, ignorance and suffering. This is the tragedy of Kali Yuga. The soul, in its search for meaning, has forgotten its true nature and become caught up in the illusions of the material world. In Kali Yuga, the very nature of consciousness is defined by a lack of clarity. The soul no longer sees the world as a reflection of the divine. Instead, it perceives the world as a place of competition, struggle, and suffering. The mind, in its quest for control, sees itself as separate from the rest of creation. It focuses on its own survival and desires, neglecting the interconnectedness of all things. This fragmentation of consciousness is further amplified by the distractions of modern life. Technology, entertainment, and material pursuits flood the mind with constant stimulation, making it difficult for the soul to hear the quiet voice of the divine. The pursuit of external pleasures, though it may bring temporary satisfaction, only serves to deepen the sense of emptiness. The more we focus on the material world, the more disconnected we become from our true nature. The path to spiritual awakening, reconnecting with the divine. Though the spiritual decline in Kali Yuga is profound, the sages also offer a path for awakening. The very fragmentation of consciousness that defines this age can also serve as an opportunity for spiritual growth. In the darkness of Kali Yuga, the divine is hidden, but it is not absent. It resides within us, waiting for us to reconnect with it. The path to awakening in this age requires an effort to turn inward and rediscover the spiritual essence that lies dormant within. The key to spiritual awakening in Kali Yuga lies in the purification of consciousness. As human beings, we must learn to detach ourselves from the distractions and attachments that bind us to the material world. We must learn to quiet the mind and reconnect with the heart. The divine is not found in the external world, but within. It is not something we need to seek outside ourselves. It is something we need to uncover by turning inward. In Kali Yuga, the practice of meditation and mindfulness becomes essential. These practices help us to silence the mind, cultivate awareness, and reconnect with the divine essence within. Through meditation, we learn to observe the fluctuations of the mind without identifying with them. We learn to detach from the ego and its desires, allowing the soul to reconnect with the eternal truth that lies beyond the limitations of the mind. The teachings of the sages remind us that the path to awakening in Kali Yuga is not easy. It requires discipline, focus, and inner strength. The distractions of the material world are overwhelming, and the pull of the ego is strong. But through consistent practice and devotion, we can begin to purify our consciousness and awaken to the divine presence that resides within us. The divine within, the essence of true consciousness. At the core of human consciousness lies the divine essence, the spark of the divine that resides within every soul. This divine essence is not separate from the world, but is the very foundation of all creation. In Satya Yuga, this essence was fully realized, and human beings lived in perfect harmony with the divine. But as the yugas progress, this essence becomes hidden beneath layers of ignorance and attachment. In Kali Yuga, it is easy to forget this divine essence. We become lost in the distractions of the material world, and the light of the soul is obscured by the fog of the mind. But the essence of true consciousness is still within us, waiting to be realized. The process of spiritual awakening is not about acquiring something new. It is about rediscovering what has always been there. The divine is not something external to us. It is the very core of our being. The sages teach us that the goal of spiritual practice is to realize our oneness with the divine. This realization comes through inner stillness and the cultivation of awareness. When we turn inward and quiet the mind, we begin to experience the divine presence that has always been with us. This experience is not intellectual, it is intuitive, direct, and transformative. It is a direct encounter with the divine essence that lies within. In Kali Yuga, the process of reconnecting with the divine may seem difficult, but it is not impossible. The light of the divine is always present, even in the darkest times. The key is to cultivate the inner vision necessary to perceive it. Through devotion, meditation, and spiritual practice, we can gradually awaken to the divine presence within us and in the world around us. And in this awakening, we can bring about the spiritual transformation that will lead to the end of Kali Yuga and the beginning of a new age of divine light. Conclusion: the potential for awakening. The fragmentation of consciousness in Kali Yuga is not a permanent state. It is a stage in the evolution of the soul. While we may feel disconnected from the divine, the truth is that it resides within us, waiting for us to awaken to its presence. The journey back to spiritual clarity begins with the purification of consciousness. The process of quieting the mind, detaching from the distractions of the material world, and reconnecting with the divine essence within. In Kali Yuga, the divine has not abandoned us. It is merely hidden, waiting for us to rediscover it. The sages have shown us the way, and through spiritual practice and inner devotion, we can once again experience the unity with the divine that existed in the golden ages of the past. The key to awakening lies within us. We are not separate from the divine, but a reflection of it. The journey of consciousness is the journey of returning to the truth of our own divine nature. Chapter 6. What happens after Kali Yuga? The darkness of Kali Yuga, while seemingly all-encompassing, is not eternal. The Vedic sages, in their profound wisdom, did not merely predict the descent into spiritual decline. They also foresaw the eventual awakening, the rebirth of spiritual consciousness, and the return of the divine. This is the most vital part of the prophecy. The recognition that Kali Yuga, despite its challenges, is not the final chapter in the cosmic story. After this dark age, the divine will gradually return, and humanity will rise once again to a higher state of spiritual clarity. This cyclical nature of time, destruction followed by creation, death followed by rebirth, is at the heart of the Yuga system. Kali Yuga, as the darkest and final age in the cycle, will eventually give way to a new cycle, the first stage of which will be Satya Yuga, the age of truth. But this transition is not a sudden event. It is a gradual process, a spiritual awakening that unfolds over time. The sages of ancient India, in their divine vision, saw that Kali Yuga would not end in a cataclysmic apocalypse or an immediate destruction of the world. Instead, they predicted a gradual shift, a spiritual awakening that would begin at the individual level, spread to communities, and eventually lead to a collective transformation of consciousness. This transition would be marked not by external destruction, but by the inner illumination of human beings as they rediscover their divine essence and reconnect with the higher planes of existence. The nature of Kali Yuga's end. A subtle transition. The end of Kali Yuga is not a sudden, explosive event. It is not an apocalyptic clash of good versus evil, nor is it marked by the violent destruction of the world. Instead, the end of Kali Yuga is a subtle and gradual shift, a transformation of human consciousness. The very qualities that define Kali Yuga, the materialism, the ignorance, the moral decay, will begin to recede, slowly but steadily, as humanity moves toward spiritual awakening. The return of the divine, as predicted by the sages, will not be an external event, but an internal awakening. This awakening will not happen overnight, nor will it happen all at once. It will be a gradual process that takes place over many generations. But even as Kali Yuga reaches its peak, signs of the divine's return will begin to emerge, often in the hearts of individuals who have been able to retain their connection to the sacred despite the pervasive darkness. This is a critical point in understanding the end of Kali Yuga. It is not about the sudden appearance of divine beings or miraculous events. It is about the gradual reawakening of humanity's spiritual consciousness, an internal transformation that leads to a greater awareness of the divine presence. The gods, in their subtle way, will re-enter the world, not through dramatic physical appearances, but through the hearts and minds of those who have opened themselves to the truth. The signs of transition, subtle and visible indicators. While the end of Kali Yuga is a subtle process, it is not without signs. The sages describe several key indicators that would signal the beginning of the transition from Kali Yuga to the next cycle. These signs, both external and internal, offer us a roadmap for understanding where we are in the spiritual cycle and what steps we need to take to usher in the next age of spiritual light. One of the most important signs of the transition from Kali Yuga to the next age is the gradual restoration of Dharma, the cosmic law that governs the universe. In Kali Yuga, Dharma has been obscured by materialism, selfishness, and ignorance. However, as the spiritual awakening begins, the principles of Dharma will begin to re-emerge. The virtues of truth, righteousness, and compassion will once again become central to human life. This will not happen in a dramatic global shift, but will unfold in the hearts of individuals who begin to live according to the higher principles of the divine. Another sign of the end of Kali Yuga is the restoration of true spiritual practices. In this dark age, religious rituals and spiritual practices have become corrupted and commercialized. The true essence of spirituality has been overshadowed by superficiality and materialism. However, as humanity begins to awaken, the genuine path to self-realization will be rediscovered. The sages predicted that people would once again engage in spiritual practices that lead to inner awakening and direct communion with the divine. The restoration of wisdom is another key indicator of the transition. In Kali Yuga, true knowledge has been overshadowed by intellectualism, materialism, and the pursuit of worldly success. But as the divine re-emerges, people will begin to rediscover the deeper truths of existence. This wisdom will not be found in books or intellectual discussions alone. It will come from direct experience and inner realization. The restoration of wisdom will be a key part of the transition from Kali Yuga to the next age. The role of individual awakening in the transition. The sages made it clear that the transition from Kali Yuga to the next Yuga, the age of spiritual light, is not a mass event that happens suddenly to the entire world. Instead, it begins with the awakening of individuals. These individuals will be those who have maintained their connection to the divine, even in the face of the overwhelming darkness of Kali Yuga. They are the ones who have kept the flame of spiritual wisdom alive, even when the material world has seemed to dominate all aspects of life. As the divine begins to return, these individuals will serve as beacons of light, guiding others towards spiritual awakening. Through their example, others will begin to see the possibility of living in harmony with the divine. These awakened individuals will not be concerned with worldly success or fame. Their focus will be on reconnecting with the divine and helping others do the same. They will practice love, compassion, and wisdom, living according to the principles of Dharma and encouraging others to do the same. The role of individual awakening is crucial in the transition out of Kali Yuga. The change will not come from external forces, but from the inner transformation of human beings. As individuals awaken to the truth of their divine nature, they will create a ripple effect that will gradually transform the world. This process is slow, but it is inevitable. The more people who awaken, the more the divine presence will become felt in the world. The world will shift from an age of ignorance and materialism to an age of wisdom, truth, and spiritual clarity. The return of divine light, the beginning of Satya Yuga. Once enough individuals have awakened to the divine within, the transition from Kali Yuga to the next age, Satya Yuga, will begin. Satya Yuga, the age of truth, is the first and most spiritually enlightened of the yugas. In this age, humanity will once again experience a direct connection with the divine. The clarity and purity of consciousness that defined Satya Yuga will return, and the world will once again be filled with spiritual light. In Satya Yuga, the divine will be fully present in the world. There will be no need for rituals or external practices, as the connection to the divine will be direct and immediate. Human beings will live in harmony with the laws of the universe, and the world will be a place of peace, wisdom, and joy. The virtues of truth, righteousness, compassion, and selflessness will flourish, and there will be no separation between the individual and the divine. However, the transition to Satya Yuga will not be sudden. It will be a gradual process, with each individual awakening contributing to the collective spiritual evolution of humanity. As the world moves toward Satya Yuga, the material distractions that dominate Kali Yuga will begin to lose their hold. The pursuit of wealth and status will no longer be the primary goal of life. Instead, people will focus on spiritual growth, self-realization, and the pursuit of wisdom. The transition from Kali Yuga to Satya Yuga will be marked by a return to simplicity and purity. In Satya Yuga, there will be no need for complex rituals or spiritual practices to connect with the divine. The world will once again be a place where human beings live in direct communion with the divine, experiencing the sacred in every moment. The gods will once again walk among us, and their presence will be felt in every aspect of life. A new cycle of creation, the eternal return. The return of Satya Yuga marks the beginning of a new cycle of creation and spiritual evolution. But this cycle is not linear. It is cyclical, eternal, and ever-repeating. Each cycle of the yugas, Satya, Treta, Dvapara, and Kali, represents a stage in the spiritual evolution of humanity. As humanity progresses through these stages, it moves closer to spiritual realization and divine understanding. However, the cycle is not without its challenges. Each yuga brings its own set of difficulties, and each one represents a different phase in the journey of the soul. But the return of Satya Yuga is also a reminder that no matter how far humanity falls into darkness, the divine is always present, waiting to be rediscovered. The end of Kali Yuga is not the end of the story. It is simply the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The eternal cycle of creation, destruction, and rebirth continues. And with each cycle, humanity grows closer to its ultimate spiritual realization. In the grand scheme of cosmic time, Kali Yuga is just a brief moment. The divine presence may seem distant now, but it is always there, waiting for us to remember. The cycle will continue, and humanity will eventually return to the divine light, experiencing the truth and wisdom that lies at the heart of existence. The divine is eternal, and as humanity awakens, it will once again align with the divine order, ushering in a new era of spiritual light. Conclusion: the eternal journey of the soul, the end of Kali Yuga, and the beginning of the next cycle is not an event to fear, but one to embrace. It is a reminder that no matter how dark the world may seem, the light of the divine is always within reach. The transition to the next age may be gradual, but it is inevitable. The soul's journey through the yugas is a journey of awakening, a journey from ignorance to enlightenment, from fragmentation to unity. As we move through Kali Yuga, we are not lost. We are simply in the process of forgetting, but the divine is always present, waiting for us to remember. And when we do, the world will begin to shift, and the light will return. The end of Kali Yuga is not the end of humanity. It is the beginning of a new cycle of spiritual awakening, a new cycle of truth, wisdom, and divine love. Conclusion: the gods are always present. Throughout the cycles of time, as humanity moves from one yuga to the next, the divine remains ever present, though often hidden, obscured, and misunderstood. The gods do not truly leave us, nor do they abandon their creations. Instead, their presence becomes concealed behind the veil of material illusion, waiting for humanity to rediscover them, to remember their true essence, and to reconnect with the divine source from which we all originated. While Kali Yuga, the age of spiritual darkness, may seem overwhelming, it is essential to understand that the gods have not completely disappeared. They are, in fact, waiting for us to awaken from our slumber of material attachment and ego-driven desires. This chapter delves deeply into the idea that the divine presence is never truly absent. It is always here, concealed in the natural world, in our hearts, in our breath, in the rhythm of the cosmos. The task is not to wait for the divine to appear externally, but to turn inward, to quiet the distractions of the mind, and to realize that the gods are always present, even in our most challenging moments. The eternal presence of the divine. The first principle to understand is that the divine is eternal. The gods, as described in the ancient texts, are not subject to the constraints of time and space. Unlike the material world, which is in a constant state of flux, the divine remains constant, unchanging, and ever-present. The gods are not confined to a particular place or time. They transcend the limitations of the physical world. Their presence is not contingent upon external circumstances or human recognition. They exist beyond the bounds of time, and they are always with us, even when we cannot perceive them. The idea that the divine is eternal and omnipresent is a foundational teaching in the Vedic tradition. The gods are not distant or removed from the world. They are embedded within it. Every particle of the universe, every atom, is imbued with divine energy. The world itself, with all of its beauty and complexity, is a reflection of the divine order. The divine is not separate from creation. It is the very fabric of existence. It is the life force that animates all things, from the smallest particle to the vastest galaxies. Even in the darkest age, when human consciousness seems to be at its lowest point, the divine is still present, though hidden. Kali Yuga, with all its material distractions, moral decline, and spiritual confusion, cannot erase the eternal presence of the gods. The gods remain concealed behind the veil of illusion, waiting for humanity to awaken to their presence once again. The darkness of Kali Yuga is not a sign that the gods have left. It is a reflection of humanity's own forgetfulness, of our inability to see the divine in our daily lives. The divine in the heart, the inward journey. One of the most profound teachings of the Vedic tradition is that the divine resides within each of us. The gods are not only external entities that reside in temples or heavenly realms. They are within our hearts, in our very souls. The process of reconnecting with the divine, especially in Kali Yuga, requires turning inward, going beyond the external distractions of the material world, and looking within to rediscover the divine essence that resides in every human being. The heart, in this context, is not just a physical organ. It is the seat of consciousness, the center of our spiritual being. It is the place where the divine resides, and it is through the heart that we can experience the divine presence. The heart is the gateway to the higher planes of existence, and it is through the purification of the heart that we can reconnect with the gods. In Kali Yuga, as the mind becomes more dominant and the ego grows stronger, we forget the divine presence within us. We become so focused on external achievements, material success, and sensory pleasures that we lose touch with our inner truth. The divine remains hidden, not because it has disappeared, but because we have turned our attention away from it. The gods are always with us, but our minds and hearts are clouded by the distractions of the material world. To reconnect with the divine, we must learn to quiet the mind and turn inward. This is the essence of meditation and spiritual practice. By stilling the mind and focusing our attention on the heart, we create a space where the divine can reveal itself to us. The divine light, which is always present, can only shine through when we remove the barriers of distraction, fear, and desire. The gods are not distant or separate from us. They are waiting within us to be recognized and experienced. The gods in nature, the sacred in the world around us. While the divine resides within our hearts, it is also present in the world around us. In Kali Yuga, when human beings often forget the sacredness of life, the gods still manifest in the natural world, in the beauty of the earth, the sky, the oceans, and the stars. Nature itself is a reflection of the divine, and every part of the natural world is infused with divine energy. The Vedic sages saw the entire world as sacred, as a manifestation of the divine. The rivers, mountains, forests, and animals are not just physical entities. They are divine expressions of the cosmos. Each element of nature is imbued with the divine essence, and through our connection to nature, we can reconnect with the gods. In Kali Yuga, however, humanity has become increasingly disconnected from nature. The modern world, with its technology, urbanization, and consumerism, has led to a profound disconnection from the natural world. We see nature as a resource to be exploited, rather than as a sacred expression of the divine. Yet, even in this time of disconnect, nature still holds the divine presence. The gods can still be felt in the rustling of the leaves, the flowing of the rivers, and the rising of the sun. Nature continues to reflect the divine order, even when we fail to recognize it. The gods are present in the world around us, in every aspect of nature, waiting to be experienced by those who are willing to slow down, observe, and listen. By reconnecting with nature, we can begin to perceive the divine once again. This is why the sages recommended that we spend time in nature, meditate by the rivers, and contemplate the stars. In these moments of stillness and reverence, we are reminded that the divine is always present, even in the most ordinary aspects of life. The gods in the present, realizing the divine, here and now. The gods are not waiting for us in some distant future or in some mythical past. They are not locked away in an inaccessible realm. They are present now, in this moment, waiting for us to recognize them. The divine is not a far-off concept or an abstract idea. It is real, immediate, and accessible. The key to realizing the divine is to shift our perception, to look beyond the surface of things, and to see the sacred in everything. In Kali Yuga, when the world seems filled with distractions and illusions, the divine presence is easy to overlook. We are taught to focus on external achievements, money, status, fame, believing that these are the things that bring happiness and fulfillment. But the divine is not found in external possessions or accomplishments. It is found in the present moment, in the stillness of the heart, and in the recognition that everything in this world is imbued with divine energy. The gods are not waiting for us to become perfect or enlightened before they reveal themselves. They are already here, already present. The divine does not demand perfection. It simply asks us to open our hearts and minds, to let go of the ego, and to see the sacredness that permeates all things. The divine is not a distant entity that we must reach out to. It is a presence that is already within us, waiting to be realized. In the teachings of the sages, the key to realizing the divine is the practice of devotion, bhakti. Devotion is not about worshiping a distant god. It is about recognizing the divine within all things and seeing the sacredness in every moment. Devotion is the act of surrendering the ego and opening oneself to the divine presence. Through devotion, we begin to experience the divine in every aspect of life, in every interaction, in every breath. The role of the divine in the future. As we move toward the end of Kali Yuga and the beginning of the next Yuga, Satya Yuga, the divine will become more directly accessible to humanity once again. The gradual awakening of human consciousness, the restoration of Dharma, and the purification of the heart will pave the way for the return of the divine light. In Satya Yuga, the connection between humanity and the gods will be direct and unbroken. The world will once again be a place where the divine is experienced in every moment, where the gods walk among us, and where spiritual truth is lived naturally and effortlessly. But this return of the divine is not something that happens from the outside. It happens within. The gods are already present in the world. They are just waiting for humanity to awaken to their presence. As we move through Kali Yuga, we are not waiting for the gods to return from some far-off place. The divine is here, in the very fabric of existence, in the depths of our hearts. It is up to us to recognize it, to awaken to it, and to live in harmony with it. The divine light that will return with the onset of Satya Yuga will not be a new light. It will be the same light that has always existed, waiting for us to rediscover it. This is the eternal truth of the divine. The gods do not come and go. They are always present. It is humanity's perception that shifts, and as we awaken, we will see the divine as it has always been, present, real, and accessible. Conclusion: the divine presence is unchanging. The gods are always present. Even in Kali Yuga, when the divine seems distant and humanity is lost in material pursuits, the divine is still here, hidden beneath the surface. The divine is within us, in the world around us, and in every moment of our lives. The task is not to wait for the gods to appear, but to awaken to their presence in the here and now. As we move through Kali Yuga, the darkness will eventually give way to light. The divine will once again become accessible to humanity, not through external events, but through the inner awakening of human consciousness. The gods are waiting for us to remember, to open our hearts, and to recognize that they have never truly left. The divine is not separate from us. It is within us, and it is waiting for us to reconnect with it. In the stillness of our hearts, in the beauty of nature, and in the sacredness of every moment, the gods are always present. The key to experiencing the divine is to open ourselves to it, to live with devotion, and to recognize the sacred in all things. The gods are always here, and they are waiting for us to remember.